This is the feedback loop of concentration, or at least the way that I conceptualize it. We're going to start with the first point in the loop. Now, the important thing I think recognize though is this is very much a loop, and so it's not that there is a starting point and an end point. It really is something that continues to recursively happen in meditation. This is the basic thing I think we're doing when we do concentration practice. What is concentration practice, by the way? For me, I define concentration as the practice of bringing attention to a single point. Okay. How do we do that? Well, first we have to decide what point we're going to bring it to. We have to select a meditation object. That's the first point in the feedback loop. Now, you could say, well, I don't do this every time I meditate, right? I usually just have this primary object I work with. And when I go to sit, I'll just work with my breath, say, or work with my body or whatever it might be. Yes. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes people will just be super focused on one thing. But other times, a practitioner, a meditator may decide they want to work with multiple objects, or they may even want to be fluidly move between objects in a single session. People become more comfortable with that once they've attained some degree of proficiency with multiple techniques. That becomes an edge in practice, is figuring out how to combine techniques skillfully. So here, let's just assume we're selecting from any number of possible objects or techniques that we know how to work with. We're selecting what we're focusing on. Let's say it's the breath. Okay, the next stage, we're going to direct our attention to the breath. That's the next point in the loop. We direct attention to the breath, to our concentration object. This is also known as the jhanic factor of vitaka in the Pali language, which means applied thought. We actually have to apply our thought to something to direct our attention to something. Once we've directed our attention to the object, say the breath, then we sustain our attention with the breath for some period of time. We have to actually stay with the object. This is called, it's another jhanic factor. It's one of the several jhanic factors that you'll see described. And this is the jhanic factor of vichara, or precise investigation, sustained thought. These are different translations of vichara. You basically stick with it, right? I like this analogy from Trudy Goodman. She was describing the practice of working with inquiry as an object of focus. So this is using a question as your primary focus. And in this case, I was using the question, what is this? And I said, okay, how do you do this practice? And she said, well, it's like when you're looking for your keys or your wallet or your phone in the morning, you don't know where they are, but you want to get them so you can leave the house and go to school or to work. When you're looking, you just maintain a consistent looking. You're just constantly looking. And you sustain that looking quality, right? If you get too upset and agitated, then you stop looking and you start freaking out about how you can't find your wallet. When you're doing that, you're no longer looking. So you want to sustain attention with the object for as long as you're able. But of course, at some point, attention will fragment. This is the fourth point in the feedback loop. And it'll fragment in particular ways, I found. There's different ways that we fragment. Sometimes we wander, the mind wanders towards something else that it likes more than what's happening, say with the breath. It's like, oh, this is much more interesting, this thought, or these body sensations, or this feeling. So we wander over to something else. Sometimes we get agitated, as I mentioned. If we can't find the thing we're looking for, we get agitated. When we sit there, we're being with the breath and say, it's not as smooth as we'd like. It's not as smooth as it was, a couple weeks ago when we were focused on the breath. That was really smooth, that one session. And we start getting agitated about that. Well, that's another way that attention fragments. In this case, we can't stay with something because we're so agitated. And then we also space out sometimes or zone out completely. The attention will just kind of zone out into space. And we've lost what it is that we're focused on. So we're fragmented. It's not like we did it intentionally. It just happened. And when there is a noticing that we have fragmented in some way, when mindfulness arises and there's this sort of recognition, then we have the chance to move into the fifth point of the loop, which is to recollect our attention and return to presence. That happens all by itself. Our attention fragments and then it starts to recollect. We come to, and then we remember what it is that we're doing. And we return back to what? Well, back to finding our object. What is it that we're doing? Back to the first point in the feedback loop. And hence, we've made one full circle around the loop. Now, the loop, what's important about this loop to me is not that we learn the points in the loop or learn how to get good at coming back to point five, for instance. No, every point in the loop is part of the practice. And what's important to me is understanding that the way that our meditation practice evolves is it evolves through a kind of recursive process of learning. One of my favorite philosophers these days is a professor named John Vervaeke, and John works at the University of Toronto, where he, I think, helped start their cognitive psychology department. In any case, John says evolution is revolution with change. That's how he describes evolution. Revolution, right? Like a circle revolving, like a Dharma wheel revolving. Every time we go through this circle, this wheel, this feedback loop, there's an opportunity for something to change, right? We learn something about our own minds. We learn how it is we relate to getting fragmented. We don't like it. We learn about how our mind does fragment. Where does your mind tend to go when you lose your focus? Are there certain places you tend to go? If so, that's interesting just to notice that about your own self and your mind. And then what meditation objects work for us and when? That's a really interesting question because it's sort of stressful not to know what to work with sometimes, right? It's like, oh, what's going to work best for me? Is it the breath? I'll just keep doing that because that's the thing I learned when I first started. Well, maybe there's another object that's much more suitable for you right now, given how things have changed or given what you now know about yourself or given that you just never really explored it. And that could be true. Very interesting, right? Recently, I was talking to a serious practitioner who's also a therapist, and he was talking about how he wants to learn more about the early Buddhist practices where you concentrate on like foul and dead bodies. And I said, "Oh, really? Why?" And he's like, "I'm an addiction specialist, and a lot of times I have the sense that a lot of people might benefit from this who are really struggling with the way that they're relating to these objects of craving." And the early Buddhist practice of foulness of the body was meant to develop a sense of repulsion, not of hatred, but just of like seeing through the idea that this thing that you really crave and want is like perfect. And of course, there's problems with the monastic model, and I think there's problems with the way that we can split ourselves. All the same, for some people, if it's like life and death to be able to figure out how to see the foulness of something that they is like in their serious addiction loop with, like, yeah, why not? That's skillful. So maybe there's something that it might even surprise you that you could be find beneficial from these traditions because there's so many different meditation objects we can work with, the breath simply being one. So yeah, this is the feedback loop of concentration. This is where I wanted to start together, mainly because I think it's good to be able to know what is the practice of concentration meditation. What is it that we're actually doing? Because it's easy enough to talk about the results. What are the results of concentration meditation? Well, if the practice is bringing your attention to a single point, the results of that practice are eventually unification. You become one with the thing you're focused on. Instead of it being an object, it becomes a subject. You become one with the meditation object. You become the subject. You become the breath. You become the kasina. You become metta. You merge with that. And in that oneness, there's a unity, there's a unification. And that's really beautiful in a lot of ways. And it's very pleasant. And in the unification experience, there's a total release, or at least a very big release of tension. And so it can be quite relieving. It can be quite healing for people to be able to access these states. It can be a nice alternative to other more harmful ways of accessing self-soothing states. And so, there's lots of potential benefits to being able to learn how to relax and still be alert, which is the hallmark of jhana, a relaxed alertness.